Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tina Ramirez, and I am very excited to have with me today Mr. Habib Malik, who is a champion of human rights and freedom of religion around the world, who is based in Lebanon. Habib and I have known each other for many years since I worked on Capitol Hill. And when I first met him, what was so exciting was that Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was really authored by his father. And so always known about Charles Malik, and he was very influential in the whole Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so getting to meet him and then hearing about his work over the last couple of decades since then in pulling together all the documents that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how it came about was it's been neat to have a kind of connection to seeing that unfold. Habib is a retired professor from the Lebanese American University, where he's done extensive research and work and written several books, which we'll share with everyone. But without further ado, I want to introduce Habib. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tina. It's my pleasure and honor.
Well, we have seen each other in Lebanon. We've seen each other in Washington, and the field that we've worked on the last 20 years has changed so much in the space of human rights and religious freedom. But I want to just get started with talking about how you came to get involved in this work. So I know it's something you've dedicated your life to. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to get involved in this work as well?
Sure. Thank you, Tina. Well, you know, I'm quite proud of the legacy of my household when it comes to human rights. And you mentioned some of my father's work in the Universal Declaration. There's much more there as well. And I also happen to live in a region that presents lots of challenges on the level of human rights. Again, that has been part of the motive. We sort of live these challenges from day to day in the Middle East. And so human rights is something very alive. It's not at all abstract or armchair. And maybe lastly, I think I'm a strong believer that education is the foremost vehicle, if you will, for cultivation, but also for positive change. And so we certainly need education to change and bring about positive change. And so that's why I'm in the field of education, and then bringing in human rights as a dimension to that field, I think is something very valuable.
Well, I mean, as an educator myself, I completely agree with you. And having gone from public school teaching, which was my first career, now into working with teachers around the world and getting to train them in human rights and religious freedom has been just so rewarding, because I've seen firsthand that, you know, it's one thing to talk about these ideas, but it's another to be able to begin to embed them in the culture. Because I think that was the hope of really the founding of the United Nations and establishing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was that this wouldn't just be a declaration signed once, you know, for all time, but that it would be embedded into the culture, that people would begin to actually respect it. And that can only happen through education. So, you know,
That's right.
And it's really, I think it's that we struggled with that. I don't know that it has been embedded. And I think now today, 70 years on, we're seeing some major challenges to it, which we can get to in a minute. But can you tell me a little bit about your father's legacy, why he was asked to actually write the first International Bill of Human Rights post-Holocaust and, you know, World War II. Can you just tell us a little bit about why he was asked, who else was with him in that process, and what was the impetus to even have an International Bill of Human Rights?
Yeah, well, you know, it was a very important moment in history, almost like a crack in history between the end of the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War. Just those few years, and they were enough for the United Nations to create this important commission, as the charter had instructed, to come up with, you know, a set of rights that would be accepted across the board and across cultures. And, you know, before the commission met and began to hammer out the details, a group led by the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain actually canvassed across cultures to see if there is a basis for universality of rights. And they came back some months later with the good news that yes, there is, and it's a good idea to proceed. Now, you said my father was tasked with doing certain things. That's true, but he wasn't alone. He was working in a group of people from all over the world, literally. I mean, you had the representative of France, a very important jurist named René Cassin. You had Chiang of China. This is China before the Communist Revolution of 1949. So Chiang brought in all of the Confucian wisdom and other very important Eastern input into the discussions. And he was the only other philosopher, technically, aside from my father, in the group. You also had the head of the secretariat of the commission, a man named John Humphrey, who was very learned from Canada, and he actually assembled so many documents that were used by the commission to distill, you know, all of the rights. So these people came from different backgrounds. They were convinced that there is a commonality across cultures of rights, grounded, of course, in the very crucial notion of human dignity. I mean, without having a clear idea that the human person is special and therefore has this unique thing which is ingrained, inherent dignity, there's no point in talking about rights. And so all of that actually was part of the context in which the discussions took place. Now, of course, in the group, which was led by Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the strongest president in the world, emerging victorious from the Second World War, of course. She was an excellent guide for the group to do their work. And along with them were several Soviet delegates. And that was, you know, in those discussions, and later on in the early 50s at the UN, one can actually trace the history of the ideological confrontations of the Cold War. And Charles Malik, my late father, was very much a spearhead in those ideological confrontations with Soviet delegates, and later on in his public speeches, you know, refuting dialectical materialism and Marxism-Leninism. But one of his main emphases was on the individual, and also on what he called the intermediate institutions, which we today call civil society, that would protect and cushion the vulnerable individual from any sort of pressures coming down from the state. And he got a lot of flack, he got a lot of pushback from the Soviet delegates, who are, as Marxism would dictate, they are collectivists. They're not, you know, the individual is just a cog in the wheel. And so there were confrontations there. They're all recorded verbatim in the discussions of the Human Rights Commission. And then Eleanor Roosevelt one day just sort of got up and said, you know, Dr. Malik has been talking about the individual and the importance of the individual. I have to say that the United States and other Western powers agree with that position. And so things began to kind of line up at that point very clearly. There are lots of stories, Tina. You know, my father's text of the preamble to the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration, that was the text that was adopted with very minor changes. And it was literally a back of the envelope thing that he wrote. He used to commute between New York and Washington by a propellered plane because he was wearing many hats. He was, you know, the ambassador of Lebanon to Washington, and he was also the Lebanese representative at the United Nations and on the Human Rights Commission. So one Friday, I believe it was June 12, Eleanor Roosevelt said, Dr. Malik, why don't you put together some ideas for a preamble? And he had taken the plane that Friday back to Washington and was going to go back to New York on Monday. And so he wrote some things on literally, as I said, a back of the envelope. And on Monday, he came back and presented his version of the preamble. René Cassin had a longer one, which was much more focused on the horrors of the Second World War. But the committee decided Malik's version is more general and perhaps more philosophical, because it talks about inherent and inalienable, and uses words that are found in the Declaration of Independence and in other famous rights documents before. And so that was the text that was actually adopted. The preamble of the Universal Declaration was largely, for the most part, written by Charles Malik.
No, it's amazing to hear the backstory, and I want to hear more because I think it's so fascinating. René Cassin was, I believe, Jewish, wasn't he? And
yes, he was Jewish, and he was very sensitive, of course, to what had happened during the Holocaust. He's a first-rate jurist and legal expert, and he had an excellent relationship with Charles Malik, my late father, and they worked very well together. Also, there were some frictions with between Charles Malik and Mr. Chang of China, because my father was grounded in the natural law tradition, the Thomistic natural law tradition, and Chang had a different approach altogether. So they had lots of interesting quarrels there, but eventually they would agree. There was a lot of common ground, and that's the beauty of the work on the Universal Declaration. People very learned people coming from very different backgrounds, eventually deciding that there is enough common ground to agree on a set of 30 articles that constitute universal rights. This is the power of the Declaration, frankly.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, it's one of the greatest, feats in all of history, is that they came together and they were able to actually agree on something of this magnitude. And in the wake of the Holocaust, of Stalin's purges, of all of the destruction of World War II that occurred, around the world, that they were able to come and recognize, and like you said, in the midst of this friction between the collectivist rights and the individual rights, that the inherent human being, you have no collective rights, you have nothing if you do not have an inherent human right for each individual. And that really flew in the face of Marxism and their vision of the world, which was so destructive. I mean, those conversations must have been extremely powerful and poignant. And I'd love to hear more about some of the interesting things that you've kind of pulled from that dialogue, and just getting people to come together from all over the world to recognize that you can't really move forward from the Holocaust, from the horrors of World War II, without starting with that foundation of human rights, especially after the League of Nations was such a failure. So what else can you tell me about that?
Well, that's right. The League of Nations was a failure. I think the shock of the Second World War, and specifically, as you mentioned, the Holocaust and Stalin's atrocities, all of these things focused the minds of these people, and they decided to get very serious about making this succeed. And, they produced a declaration. Now, legally speaking, declarations are just that. They're not binding. And then they spent several years at the UN trying to create protocols that would hold states accountable. They didn't work. I'm talking about the 1966 protocols. They didn't work because states would only sign if there were escape clauses, such as something like everything in this protocol is subject to the laws of the state. That's the escape clause. And so the declaration, even though it has only moral power, it ended up having a much greater influence tangibly in actual events than any of these protocols. I can say that the movements in Eastern Europe that were rising up against communism, and that eventually brought about the toppling of communism, they all referred to the Universal Declaration as kind of their banner, their set of bedrock ideals. The same is true in South Africa when it comes to the elimination of the apartheid system. Again, it was the Universal Declaration, not the protocols, that people appealed to. One can even see echoes of this in more recently in what we have come to term the Arab Spring, although most of what happened in the Arab Spring ended up producing very little. I mean, it was, I think, a very genuine kind of uprising, but it generally hit a brick wall in most of these countries. But again, the Universal Declaration was attractive to many of the thinkers there. So this is the power of this declaration. It's moral power.
What do you see as your father's greatest legacy in that whole process? What would you say?
Well, look, as I mentioned, the preamble is very important because it's a philosophical document, but you yourself in the introduction mentioned Article 18, which is the article for religious freedom. And I think he actually wrote that text and they adopted it without any changes. And
wow.
Absolutely, and he saw fit to include in it something that you can actually infer, but he wanted it to be spelled out, and that is the right to change one's religion. I mean, if you have religious rights, then it's almost by implication that you can change your religion, but he didn't want to leave it as an implication. He actually put that in there. And it was quite a gamble because, you know, Saudi Arabia was about to vote against the declaration because of that particular clause in Article 18. You know, the strict Wahhabi interpretation of Islam would consider that to be apostasy, and apostasy, according to strict Sharia, is punishable by death. So they can't vote for something like that. And so a lot of behind the scenes lobbying took place, and my father was involved in that, talking to the Saudi delegates and so on, and telling them, look, why do you want this stain on your reputation that you voted against it? Abstain. If you cannot stomach this particular clause and this particular article, go ahead and abstain, but don't vote against the entire declaration. And that's what ended up happening. So the Saudis abstained. There were other abstentions as well. But, you know, on December 10, when the voting actually took place, 1948, no country voted against the declaration, which is a remarkable accomplishment, I think.
Well, and it's I mean, anyone that's a part of the United Nations has to accept the Universal Declaration as part of its charter. So every nation in the world now has, you know, agreed or has, you know, has recognized that the Universal Declaration really is the standard for human rights in the world.
Right, and many countries actually integrated the declaration whole into their constitutions.
No, it's amazing what happened. I mean, it's remarkable. And I think the greatest challenge then of 1948 was, how do we get this to be really inculcated into the cultures, infused in the cultures of the world, so that this idea, you know, from pre-World War II, that somehow life is expendable, that we actually begin to treat life with greater dignity and respect, regardless of who people are, what they believe, or where they're from. And so that's been really the greatest challenge over the last 70 years, is how do we do that? And I know, you know, even today, you must look at the conversations that are happening around the world over the Marxist ideas. And I just would love for you to share maybe just your own reflections on how do you feel when you see Marxism and socialist ideas being paraded around as something to aspire to in the world? I mean, that must be shocking in light of everything we accomplished 70 years ago.
Right, and not only that, but in many ways, Marxism as an ideology failed openly and has been relegated to the dustbin of history. And yet you have people who continue to go back and try to weaponize some of these ideas out of nihilism, out of bankruptcy. Who knows what motivates them? But you know what? There is an important thinker from the early 20th century who is not very well known, but he actually managed to weaponize some of the elements of Marxism into cultural Marxism. And I'm talking about Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist, and he he's the father of what we could refer to as cultural Marxism, which was later on developed by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and then eventually made its way all the way up to, and you have in academia things like post-colonial studies influenced by people like the late Edward Said and so on, all the way up to today's proto-Marxist groups like BLM and others that pretty much peddle a Gramscian cultural Marxism, which is not class-based as classical Marxism is, but is race-based at this point, and wants to rewrite all of history based, world history, but also America's history, based pretty much on a contrived narrative that, everything goes back to race and racial discrimination and so on, completely ignoring that since 1965, tremendous advances for people of color have taken place in the United States, all the way up to a two-term president who is Black, and a current vice president, and some really great figures in American culture who have made it and who are very wealthy, are also not whites. LeBron James comes to mind, and others in the in the field of athletics and so on. So yeah, it's unfortunate that a failed ideology like Marxism kind of finds ways of rearing its head again in these destructive, newfangled, reformulations.
Well, you're absolutely right, Habib, and I've seen this firsthand, and just here in my own country and in the schools and the issues we're facing. And what's so, bewildering to me is that you live in a region of the world that's extremely tribalistic, where tribalism and trying to separate and divide over race and ethnicity and religion is just commonplace, and it's extremely destructive. And you see it firsthand, like you shared in the beginning. This is a region of the world where human rights issues are front and center. You're on the front line. And so I'm always amazed that people in the West that have been able to achieve such great advances in freedom and dignity for people are going backwards and trying to become more tribalistic, which has never resolved conflict. I just look at the work that we do with Hardwired in countries like Iraq, where we're able to help children that were brainwashed by ISIS to be terrorists and to hate and kill people that look or believe differently, to overcome that through human rights, through teaching them inherent human dignity, that all people are valuable. It's not by teaching them Marxism or that there's some class struggle here that they need to fight against. It's by teaching them that human beings are valuable, which really goes back to your life work in the field of education and trying to get these universal principles really, infused throughout the society. So can you tell me a little bit about, being a professor, the importance of learning history and studying history and of teaching history and just, education to the promotion of human rights?
Through the foundation that we created here in 1989 in Lebanon, called the Foundation for Human and Humanitarian Rights, we kind of did two things. We had an education component whereby we devised a basic standard course on human rights, an introductory course to human rights, which talks about all of these issues. Why is the human being special and important? Why does the human person have rights? Where do these rights come from? And we give, an overview which is philosophical, perhaps even / theological, and then we go to, and as well secular, because the three very often overlap on some of these basics. And then we have another component, which is the advocacy component, the actual practical component. Now, with the course on human rights, we managed to introduce it as part of the curriculum in 7 private universities in Lebanon. which and it continues to be offered. I offered it at my university for a few years, and then others took over and did the same. So yeah, I mean, as I was trying to say initially at the start of our conversation, education is certainly the way to bring about positive change. And it is maybe the most formative activity for young, impressionable minds if it's done in the right way. And certainly emphasizing something like universal rights, as opposed to what we see around us today, which is a kind of proliferation of pseudo rights, a kind of unbridled cottage industry of so-called rights that are trying to rival the established universal rights. It's very important to make these distinctions in the context of education, and to give actual case studies of these things.
Well, and Habib, you mentioned something really important that, in the last 7 years, we saw like the first generation of human rights, they used to call like the civil and political, and the second generation socio and economic, and the third generation. And then, since then it's just kind of expanded so that everybody calls anything they want to have a right. And they devalue the whole basis of what human rights are, which is this idea of inherent human dignity and the important protection of the expression of that in an individual's life. And so, do you mind just kind of going back into, a little bit more of the philosophical conversation around what is a human right? Why do they exist? I mean, because give us a framework so that people can understand when they're looking at this big, canopy of purported rights. How do you judge a right? Like, how do you know? Like, what is a human right?
Well, Tina, it all boils down to how a person defines life in general and human life in particular. If your definition of life is purely mechanistic and materialist, meaning it's all a question of physics and chemistry, if that's your definition of human life, neglecting very important dimensions like freedom, like agency and will, like a moral sense, like conscience, like the whole idea that using human reason, one can actually discover certain naturally given realities. And this is the whole point of natural law. I mean, one of the earliest texts was Sophocles' play Antigone. And there you have a very clear clash between natural law, what your conscience tells you, versus state law or positive law. Whatever the law happens to be under a particular ruler or regime at any given point in time. There's a huge difference between the two. They don't always align. And the reason this is the case is because either there is a power grab on the part of the authorities so that laws become just a tool to stay in power, or, going back to what I just said, the human person is defined in this very materialist, mechanistic sort of way, which doesn't account for conscience, doesn't account for some kind of internal faculty that responds to issues of right and wrong, good and bad, true and false, and begins to distance people from actual reality. I mean, look around you today. Men can become women, women can become men. Why? Because they may get up in the morning and feel like they are. This has nothing to do with biology. This has nothing to do with reality, but this is what's being pushed on the culture. You see, what I feel like doing ultimately decides truth and reality. This is very problematic. Feelings are very important, but at the end of the day, reality and sometimes facts don't often care for people's feelings.
Well, we know that the Marxists and the communists and the socialists and all the people that destroyed so many human lives didn't really care about anyone's feelings. They were just set on their power grab, as you said. And, that's why we need a structure that says human beings have value. And I think what's so interesting about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and really the mechanisms that came out of it is it was the first time in, I mean, in many ways for the whole global community, that state governments were finally held to account for how they treat the individual within their jurisdiction, let's say. And that was critical. I remember one of the jurists at the Nuremberg trials made a comment. I don't remember if it was during that time or afterwards, but he said, you know, we will be judged, the next 50 years will be judged on, if the next 50 years are anything like the last 50 years, we're in trouble. And so to ensure that they're not, in 50 years, they will judge us based on what we've done to help create, create a vision that we can move forward and begin to achieve greater human dignity through not less. And I think, so I'd like to, so if you look back on the last 70 years, I mean, my judgment of our last 70 years, we've definitely made a lot of progress, but there's been a lot of, there have been more Holocausts, there have been more genocides. What would your, if you look back in the last 70 years, how would you judge how we've done in the field of human rights?
Right. Well, look, there is no panacea that is somehow human-made that will wave a magic wand and improve things. That said, of course, I think there's a very impressive legacy for human rights work internationally since the Universal Declaration. So many NGOs, so many individual and group initiatives across the world, even in countries where the regime was against all of that. People took great risks in order to stand up to oppression and to fall back on those 30 odd articles of the Universal Declaration as being timeless and universal. This is really the great accomplishment of 1948. You know, we've had all kinds of rights documents that were in individual countries ever since the Magna Carta in Britain, and then, you know, during the American Revolution and the French Revolution, we had documents specific to those countries. This is the first time kind of the whole world got together and agreed on these rights. Now, yes, there have been violations, there have been genocides, they continue to, until today. You know, the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, there's a lot going on, which is very reprehensible. And there are still nasty regimes out there and so on. The mere fact that we have a standard, we have a benchmark, we have, as I said, a declaration that has moral power, that was appealed to by those who were trying to topple communist oppression in Eastern Europe and trying to topple a discriminatory system based on color in South Africa. The mere fact that we have that benchmark and that it helped in the success of those movements tells me that there is hope ahead, and that one of the greatest things that has been done by the human rights movement is that it has focused the spotlight of publicity and exposure on abuses. It shames people, it shames regimes. And some of these regimes are very thick-skinned, but still, they have to live in a world where they need to interact with others. And so shaming them openly for the awful things they do is definitely one of the legacies of the human rights movement. And I am, this is what gives me a lot of hope moving forward.
You know, it goes back to what you were saying when you were describing the debate over collectivist versus individual rights. I don't think we can understate how significant that victory was to have a universal declaration of human rights based in the inherent dignity of the individual, because Absolutely. Around the world, it's individuals within authoritarian societies where they're not free, that are empowered by this idea, hey, my government might be telling me that I don't have any value. My society or my community or this terrorist group or whatever are telling me I don't have any value. I just look at, like, for instance, the Yazidi girls in northern Iraq who were told by ISIS, you have no value, you're devil worshippers, you're nothing. Yeah. And yet when we went in with these educational materials and told them, no, you have human rights, regardless of what anyone says, you have value as an individual. you know, regardless of your community, you still have value. Regardless of what happens to you, you still have value. Don't believe what they're saying. Know that you have rights. And that's empowering them. And so within, you know, around the world in enclosed regimes, even behind the Great Firewall of China or in North Korea, people are beginning to rise up and to say, this isn't right. I am an individual human being who has value and should have rights and should have them protected by my government. And like you said, it's so funny that the Marxists constantly want to push the collectivist and whatever their vision of the world is, but it never works. The only thing that works is every individual human being recognizing that whatever other people say, that their conscience deep inside of them says, and they know deep down that they have value. And that's what leads them to fight for it and to actually expand this field of human rights. It's not expanded by groups saying, well, we think we're better than others, and we're going to, you know, to engage in this class warfare or, you know, racial warfare against one another. It's really people recognizing that in regardless of what you look like or what you believe, there's an inherent value to every person that needs to be fought for and achieved within society.
And absolutely. And, you know, this is the power of the human rights movement, that they tell individuals, you don't owe your rights to the state or to your culture or to the color of your skin or to any of these, you know, differentiating factors. You owe your rights to the fact that you are a living, breathing human being. The very fact that you are human means hardwired in you, if I can use the term, are these rights. And so, you know, no state, no ideology should come and kind of make you feel that you owe that state or ideology your rights. You don't. In fact, they owe you protection of these rights, recognition of them and protection of them. This is, I think, the most central idea that the human rights movement has brought to the fore. And it's a revolutionary idea. It's an amazing idea.
It is. I mean, and that's why, I mean, both of us have dedicated our life to it, because we've seen hope. We've seen people find and experience greater freedom and dignity. And what better joy is there in life to see that, and to have this legacy that you can build upon is just, I mean, it's remarkable. And I'm so glad that you documented it so that it'll live on for many more generations to see and to learn about and to study, so that we don't forget from whence we came. You know, we don't want to repeat the same mistakes in history. And so if we don't, we need to go back and study our history to better understand it. And this foundation is critical to that.
Absolutely. You know, Tina, going back to the foundation that we put together here in Lebanon, on the advocacy side, and this shows you against the power of human rights when they are approached, you know, correctly. We would defend openly victims of attacks or persecution by radical Islamists. And then when the same radical Islamists were arrested and put in prison under appalling conditions, we would step in and defend their rights for having better conditions in incarceration. Another example is when the Syrians were occupying Lebanon until the year 2005, we had to defend lots of people who were targets of abuse by the authorities that were pro-Syrian in Lebanon. Then after 2005, when Syria left Lebanon, the new government that came began to exact retribution from some of these individuals. And one person in particular who used to be a big violator of people's rights, and his victims were many of the people we advocated for. He himself was put in prison under bad conditions. Our foundation stepped in to defend his rights. And when he was later released, you know, he summoned to his office some of the people he had actually put in prison and tortured, and he thanked them. And now he's a deputy. He's a member of parliament in Lebanon, of course, and he's supporting, again, Hezbollah and the Syrians and so on. But my point is, I'm not talking politics. My point is serious human rights work focuses on the human being and focuses on unjust violations of rights, regardless of who is the target of that. And you could have a violator who later, has his or her rights violated that goes beyond, let's say, just punishment. And then you need to step in and defend them. So that's what we have done.
I think it's amazing, Habib. I'm so glad you shared that, because I think it's the perfect example of what we need to achieve. That, and I've seen in our own work, and I'm sure you see this as well, that when you begin to treat people with that basis of human dignity and help defend their rights, even when they might have been in the wrong in the past, it softens them to this value of human dignity, human rights for all people, and they change. Mm-hmm. And so that living out that testament to others is so critical in the promotion of human rights and, and securing it worldwide.
Right.
Well, I would love, I know that we've kind of talked a lot broadly about issues in the world and human rights and a little bit about Lebanon, but I would love for you to share, because, Lebanon sits in a region of the world where there has been a lot of conflict in the last 2 decades in particular. A lot of extremism has been arising. We've been, as an organization, very involved there related to helping with education in some of these contexts to help prevent the radicalization of kids and help build resiliency against extremist thinking. But can you tell us a little bit about, you wrote a book about 10 years ago on the future of Middle Eastern Christians. And so I'd love for you to just give us a little overview of that and share a little bit about that work that you did and what's happened in the 10 years since you wrote it.
Right. It's interesting. I wrote it in 2010 before anybody had ever heard of ISIS and of the atrocities that they didn't exist at the time. And yet I kind of anticipated that we were headed in that direction under the general heading of extremist Islamism. And that actually came about. Back in 1991, I also wrote an article about the future of Christian Arabs, in which I said that the 21st century is going to see some religious wars, a return of religious wars. And sadly, I was correct to some extent. So I've kind of had my finger on the pulse of things around here. So yes, we have, we're dealing, in Lebanon, Lebanon has had a very checkered history, but in the good times, it has been undisputedly the freest society in the Arab world by far, despite all of its problems. And even today is a particularly bad time for Lebanon for a variety of reasons. The country is kind of hijacked by a very vicious mafia militia cartel. And when I say militia, I mean pretty much the armed group in the country that is beholden to Iran. And the mafia is our criminal political class that has defrauded the state, defrauded the banks, defrauded people, and essentially there's this kind of alliance between the two of them. Lebanon is not what it used to be. But even in this very dark period, there are elements in Lebanese society of freedom that outshine other Arab societies. And I think when you come to a freedom-starved part of the world like the Middle East, and you find some homegrown freedom there, even if it is beleaguered and besieged and tarnished and so on, I think it's worth trying to nurture it and to protect it. And here, I hope these words will have some resonance in official Washington, because at the end of the day, a monochromatic Middle East that has only one color and that completely undermines pluralism and diversity and variety, which are very enriching, and which actually this diversity and variety in the Middle East has spawned a lot of moderation among Muslims near and far. And so once you stifle that kind of pluralism and the little oases of homegrown freedom, it's very difficult to bring them back. And so that would be my pitch for the importance of paying attention to homegrown freedom in a freedom-starved place like the Middle East. And certainly human rights is one approach, and one very effective approach. But also, the region is being emptied of its non-Muslim natives because of persecution, because of difficulties, because of economic suffering and poverty and so on. Again, opportunities on those levels coming from the more affluent countries that have an interest in the region. And again, partnering with civil society, not with the nasty governments. Direct partnering from benevolent Western sources to civil society. I think that would encourage people basically to give the place another chance, even though they had been suffering there a lot.
Well, I remember when you wrote the book, I was working on the Hill at the time and hosting a lot of hearings and briefings in Congress on what was happening in the Middle East and our foreign policy, and particularly in Iraq, and how, we were ignoring really this red line of religion and of the religious dimension of the conflict, and of the disproportionate impact the conflict was having on faiths that had smaller populations than the majority. Mm-hmm. And it's been tragic. I remember just when the war began in Iraq, when the U.S. first went in, that there were, I think, 50,000 Mandaeans, which were traditionally followers of John the Baptist, yes. Jewish individuals that followed John the Baptist, and lived near sources of water, and didn't proselytize. They lived within their own community and intermarried within their own community. Uh-huh. And immediately after the war, there were about 5,000 left within a few years. Amazing. And now there's a few thousand maybe left of the community in Iraq. And that's just one community, which when it's dispersed or killed and forced into other countries as refugees, then doesn't have the ability to continue itself because they only marry within their faith. And so it makes it very difficult to sustain their religion, their faith, their community, their traditions. And I think you could say the same thing of the Yazidis and many other communities. And then of course we know of the Christian community and what happened there. I remember actually after it was around 2010 or 2011 actually, because it was before the civil war in Lebanon, or in Syria, traveling to Syria, and the Syriac patriarch, they're telling me, Tina, if what happened in Iraq happens here, we won't survive. And so then when the civil war did start there and ISIS did take a foothold in parts of the country, they were terrified because they saw that they wouldn't survive. And we saw the destruction of so much property across Syria. But I mean, all of the religious property and history in northern Iraq was destroyed during that conflict. It's been an absolute disaster to see hundreds of thousands of innocent, ancient believers with ancient religious communities from this region that overnight, with both the situation in Iraq, the fall of Saddam, and then the rise of ISIS, that have just been forced out of the Middle East, of the region, or forced into refugee camps, and eventually, fleeing to other countries. It's tragic because you're losing part of the culture of those countries when you lose, entire groups of people that maintained right. that history, that pluralistic history. Right. And, we lose something as, I think, a global community as well in losing that. And it's interesting when you refer to pluralism, because very few people really talk about the value of that in the Middle East, and of helping create freedom in those communities so that people can come back and return and rebuild and be a part of the reemergence or the restoration of history and of culture in those societies. I know that, with Hardwired, that's something we've been very focused on, is in our work with the re-education of children in Mosul and the Nineveh Plains of northern Iraq in particular, we've seen how we can overcome that cycle of conflict and help people see a path forward to actually living together with peace and respect for one another when we teach them the very values that we talked about at the beginning of human dignity, of human value, and of freedom of conscience for all people. So I guess coming full circle, it's what your father and Rene Cassin and Chang and so many of the others that wrote that Universal Declaration of Human Rights did has led to hope and freedom and dignity for millions and millions of people around the world in the last 70 years, and is really the only true basis to have these societies see a path forward, in my opinion. And so to the extent that you and I and so many others can continue to educate and to teach others the values and fight for the basis of it in individual rights and human dignity, I mean, that's something I'll champion till the day I die. I don't see any other path forward. So, I mean, anyway, any last thoughts on just what's happened to the Christian community in particular in the Middle East, or, with the rise of extremism, or what's happened to pluralism as a result of the situation?
Just comment on what you just said, the last point. Freedom itself is contagious, meaning if communities live side by side with and interact on a daily basis with free individuals, with time, these communities change, and often change for the better. But if you live side by side and interact with unfree people, or what are generally called dhimmis, if we're going to talk about non-Muslim communities in the Middle East subjugated as second-class citizens, you interact with people like that over long periods of time, you don't change. So freedom is really the key here. And especially if you have freedom that has survived centuries of persecution and paid a huge price in terms of property and in terms of suffering and blood, it's a very valuable commodity. It is the key to change for the better in the future for these societies. And that's why I'd say Lebanon, for all its faults, and it has a million problems, literally one followed by 6 zeros, does have one thing going for it, and that is that it has managed to preserve the freest Arab society among all other Arab societies. And the reason for that is because Lebanon contains the last remaining native, rooted, free Christian community. And so for that alone, that reason alone, I think people should pay attention. People who want a better Middle East, a more stable and more moderate Middle East, should, I think, pay attention to the cultivation of freedom, and specifically freedom in a place like Lebanon. These would be my parting thoughts.
Well, let me ask you one more final thought on that note. I mean, because that diversity is so critical, and I agree with you, when you actively engage people that are different, it creates a more vibrant civil society and marketplace of ideas, and greater protection for all people, because you have to navigate your rights in relation to others' rights, and you have to find a way for everybody to have the same kind of freedom. In a place like Iraq, which has been so depleted of its religious minority communities, what is the path forward there? Is there a path forward? What would you say to your neighbors in Iraq to get to the point where they can achieve some semblance of pluralism?
Look, let me tell you, I think the best political prescription for composite societies or heterogeneous societies with different groupings, and that would include Lebanon as well, but certainly Iraq and Syria and so on, the best prescription is some form of creative federalism. Now, federalism is a very misunderstood word in the Middle East. Unfortunately, people out of ignorance confuse it with fragmentation. Federalism is not that. And then there are people who oppose federalism because they realize that it will rob them of their bid for power and oppressing others. So I think well thought out federal formulas would give diverse groups, regardless of their demographic sizes, it would provide them with layers of protection, even on the local level, that would stand them in good stead. Now, the problem with federalism is you can't impose it top down. It has to come bottom up, meaning there has to be a general climate that is conducive to different communities saying, you know what, let's get together and devise a federal formula. I think in places that have suffered a lot, like Iraq, like Lebanon, elsewhere, Syria, I think there is a ground, the ground is ripe, rather, for precisely the emergence of this consensus that we need to follow the federal route. And, you know, federalism it can be tailored pretty much, it's very malleable. It can be tailored to fit almost any set of givens on the ground. It doesn't have to be, for instance, territorial federalism. It could be constitutional. People don't have to shift their homes from one place to the other. They can have protections under the Constitution. They can have added layers of protection on the local level. We can maybe refer to the Swedish notion of the ombudsman, or even the Russian notion of the oblast. These are very interesting ideas that can be tweaked to provide layers of protection for minorities living within other minorities. So I think for Iraq, your question was about Iraq, but I'm giving an answer that really applies to all heterogeneous communities. I think that federalism is the way to go in the future. Unfortunately, historically, Britain and France, the two countries that had the mandates over this region in the early 20th century, they were both unitary countries. And so they didn't have much of an appreciation for federalism. The United States, on the other hand, does have an appreciation for federalism. And so that's, I think, an area where a possible solution can be devised.
Well, and I understand what you're saying because they often look to quotas for minority groups within these countries because they have parliamentarian systems that, you just kind of get into a party and then they'll stick you somewhere. But those parliamentarians really aren't very accountable to the individual people within their constituencies because they're never actually voted on by their constituents. The constituents vote for a party, not a person. Yeah. And so the more, accountable you can be to an individual, like within the human rights system, the more progress you can make on individual rights. And so, and on the voices of those communities. And so it's definitely something that we really haven't seen a lot of in the region. And it's definitely something to be considering, to think about moving forward as the community struggle through how to navigate the changes that they've seen and the freedoms that they desire. So, and the representation that they want across the board. So Habib, I'm so glad that we got a chance to catch up and to just, share so much of the history of the Universal Declaration and Article 18 and just your father's work and legacy and all of the work that you've done to embed these freedoms into Lebanon and the region and to be a voice for this. So thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And I'm really, really happy that we've reconnected like this. And hopefully next time I'm in Washington, we'll be able to see each other and the pandemic will be behind everybody.
I completely agree.